Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, viewers. Good afternoon, Linda. One more episode of In Conversation with. We have with us Linda from Netherlands. She is a sustainability expert and she has a presentation for us. Let's move on to the presentation after a few candid questions. So, Linda, tell us about your journey. You are an SDG expert. Your qualifications are also aligned to what you are currently doing. That is very rare. I am qualified in marketing, but I am a finance professional, and then I worked in finance. So how is everything aligned in your life? You always knew what you were going to do.
Oh, definitely not. I think for a long time I felt like things weren't aligned, but when I look back, then it seems like they were. And I think you're right to say that I'm now at a point where I feel like things are very much in line. I'm originally South African. I come from a very small town in South Africa, and I grew up during the apartheid era in a place that was surrounded by nature. So throughout my young life, and also the way that my parents brought me up, I was aware of the importance of taking care of nature, but also aware of the social problems in the society around me. And so from a very young age, that awareness led to the feeling that I wanted to do something about it. I just didn't know what. And so I spent quite a while in my professional career searching for the right place. So I'm trained as an economist, but I also have a training in philosophy and econometrics. I've worked in the financial sector, I've worked for universities, but most recently, the largest part of my career, I have been a consultant where I help companies, mostly large multinationals, but I've also worked in the public sector. I've also worked for small organizations with becoming more sustainable. So that means understanding the impact that they make on society, whether it's environmental or social or other aspects of sustainability, and looking at how they can really incorporate that into their business strategy. And I've been lucky enough to work with the UN, with the UN Global Compact, with the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, and with many other people who are doing fantastic work in this space. So I'm grateful to have been able to make that contribution, and I hope to do more for the rest of my career.
Okay, so see, when I'll tell you our background. So we started from New York, and now we're present in 50 odd countries. We primarily started with CSR education. So we said, let's educate people on CSR and sustainability. School children, college grads, post grads, and CXOs, so all levels. Then we went into volunteering. Today we run the world's largest volunteering platform with 3 million plus volunteers in India alone. Now we are going into last mile fulfillment for NGOs and corporates, because we already have 3 million children. So last mile fulfillment becomes economical, cheaper for corporates. So we can deliver double of any other, if you compare us to any other last mile provider, we work at 50% of the cost because we already have 3 million children, rural, tribal, you name it, and we have those kind of people, volunteers with us. So it becomes easier for us. So, our journey was in the value chain. We are moving like that. And now we are trying to set up an ESG platform. We are trying to set up a university. So, you can see us moving in the value chain. But if you ask me, what is the one single most important thing in sustainability that I like or I would like to promote, then there are really top of my mind. I have two things. One is sustainable manufacturing. Yeah. And second is ethics and corporate governance. So personally, my opinion, and I'm entitled to an opinion, although it may be wrong. My opinion is that, yeah, so in the entire range of CSR and sustainability, right, from impact, investment to bonds to everything, I think ethics and corporate governance play a very large role. And manufacturing, sustainable manufacturing plays a very large role. So these are the two topmost things which, I think will lead to a sustainable world. So in the same way, if I ask you a question that within the forte of sustainability, right, from ESG to, reporting to bonds, to manufacturing, to artificial intelligence, to smart cities, to education. There are so many things. What are the top two things that you think the world should be working on? The top two, you know?
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and you'll see later what I mean by that. I think it's climate and inequality. And the reason I think those things are important is because I think if you tackle them, you touch on a whole range of other elements as well. And I think to tackle them properly, you also need to understand the complexity underneath. So those are the things that I think that the world should be working on. But I want to add a nuance because I don't think that that's necessarily what should be the priority for everybody. And again, we'll take a look at that a little bit later in the presentation. For me, it's really whether you're a company or a non-for-profit or whether you're just an individual person, it's about looking at where can we or I make a contribution, and using my background, my skills, my company, my place in the value chain, what's our niche, and how can we contribute to sustainability in the way that we can do best and we can make the biggest impact. And I think that that's the key, because that's when you're really going to see a good fit, and you're really going to see all of us moving in the right direction if everybody picks up on what they're best at.
We will come back to that later. I will come back to that question later again, because when you talk about involvement, involving people and how can I make a small difference, that was our core when we started the volunteering platform. So we said, let's involve millions of people, millions of students, and then work upwards, So we start with students. If they want to change the world, the corporates don't have a choice. They will have to change, So that is why we started with students. So I can see that you have very similar thoughts. So we will touch upon that again. Let's have a look at your presentation. You have something for us today.
Sure, and if I don't touch on the role of students during the presentation, I'll try to remember it. But if I don't, let's come back to it at the end, because I think, yeah, absolutely important things to say about that.
Absolutely.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation. What I'd like to talk about today is the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And I will give a short intro to them further on in the presentation for those who are not familiar with them yet. But what I'll also specifically be talking about is what is the role that business can play. And I'll be sharing some of my experiences around what we see business doing, but also what we see that business can do more. What I'd like you to bear in mind is that while I'll be talking about the role of business, many of these lessons, many of these insights can be used if you're in another situation as well. And perhaps we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. So moving on, where are we now? I talked a little bit in the beginning about climate and inequality. So that's the kind of the planet side and the people side. If you look at the planet side, this figure of the planetary boundaries, there are 9, it's from the Stockholm Resilience Institute. And you can see that for many of those, at least those that we were able to measure, we're either at risk or we're way over that. So for biodiversity, for example, or if you're looking at phosphorus or nitrogen in the soil, we're way over. Even those where we seem to be more or less in the safe zone, or it looks like we might be in the safe zone, something like fresh water use. I think we know if you read the newspaper or look around you that there are certainly parts of the world where fresh water use is becoming a problem. So even though it may look like we're okay, there's still reason for concern. And I think those concerns are getting greater and greater. On the other hand, societies remain highly unequal. So this is a graph that goes through to 2015. That's coincidentally also the year when the SDGs were launched. And you can see, if you look at the Gini index, which is a measure of inequality, from 1990 to 2015, things are not getting better. And what we also see, the current COVID situation, it's also been in many of the newspapers that a lot of the poorest are getting hardest hit because they're vulnerable either through their work, through being unemployed, or just through the situations in which they live. So what we're going to see is a lot of pressure moving towards inequality, and something that we need to give attention. But now back in 2015, this is also what was on the minds of the world's leaders. So in 2000, we had the Millennium Development Goals through to 2015. Many people know about these. They were very much focused on countries that were still developing. And you can see a large focus on health, on society, on social aspects, but not so much focus on the environment. So let's say a more narrow set of goals. Now, having said that, the Millennium Development Goals were very successful, and that led to this idea, or was one of the things that led to the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, they've been called, you can see it at the top there, the closest thing that the world has to a strategy. And to me, that kind of says it all. So the Sustainable Development Goals are for all of us, whether you're in a developed country, a less developed country, whether you are working in business, whether you're a university, a student, a private individual, whatever, they're for all of us to get behind. And I think that was a major victory. To me, it seems sometimes like a miracle that all of the governments in the United Nations signed up to these goals, which is absolutely fantastic. And if you look at them, you'll see the whole range. They're a lot broader than the Millennium Development Goals. So we have the, let's say, traditional social goals: poverty, zero hunger, health, education, gender equality. But you'll also see in the middle there, decent work and economic growth, industry, sustainable cities. So really things that can appeal a bit more to business. And then also the environmental aspect as well. And then, of course, the most important of the SDGs, number 17, partnerships. Although I said the most important, but that's, you'll see a little bit later, perhaps not quite the right thing to say, because one of the things that was very clear with the launch of the SDGs is that they're all equally important and they're interconnected. So under these SDGs, they may look like a lot of colorful marketing pictures, but there's a whole story underneath. Underneath these 17 SDGs are 169 targets, and those targets make the SDGs more concrete, and they tell us which direction we need to be moving in, whether it's talking about acidification of the oceans, or whether it's talking about the number of young people getting jobs, the number of boys and girls in schools. That gives us the real direction under the SDGs. So it's not just a free-for-all, I'm doing something with health, therefore I'm contributing to the SDGs. No, it's really the direction. And why do I say that? Because it's really important. The reason the SDGs are there is because they want us to all move in the same direction. So we're contributing to the same things and really harnessing our collective power across the world. Now, I've put this in here. You might have seen it. It's been traveling around the internet lately. And the reason I put it there, I thought this cartoon really hits the nail on the head for me. What we saw when the COVID crisis hit, when there was a shortage of masks or a shortage of materials, is that we almost saw the opposite of the feeling behind the SDGs. We saw nation states becoming more insular. We saw more nationalism and a lot less sharing, if you like. And I think that those feelings have subsided a little bit, but they're certainly still there. When you look at the race for a vaccine, or you could say the race to Mars or the race to the moon, it seems like everybody wants to be first. But if you look back in terms of what has been done on climate, some countries have been stepping up, but other countries, other parties have been saying, well, let's wait and see. I don't want to be first. And that's very dangerous. That's what we need to break through. And that's why we really need this thinking behind the SDGs, because they are, if we go back to them, a lot of the things with the SDGs are things that we can only achieve together because they run across countries, across value chains, and we all play our part by doing a piece of it in collaboration with others. Now, these pictures, I'm just, let me move this up a little bit so you can see it. There we go. don't get a fright. It's not about what's in the details, but I put these pictures in here. They're actually all from the same report, talking about how the SDGs are interconnected. So if you look at the picture we had before, it looks, well, you could say relatively simple. 17 is a lot, but still, you know, you can digest it. This looks almost overwhelmingly complicated. Well, despair. What these pictures show is how the different SDGs are interconnected. And they're interconnected in different ways depending on how you look at it. So this one, if you look at the top left, is quite a famous one. It's called the wedding cake as a joke. And what they say in this one is that, well, the biosphere, the environment, that's the basis for everything. That allows us to have a functioning society. And that then allows us to have economic growth. Now, that's one way of looking at it. You can look at these other pictures, they show the connections in different ways. And you'll see a lot of dots because some of them focus not on the SDGs, but on the underlying targets. So just think of a simple example, if you like. Climate change could lead to water scarcity, which could lead to migration, which could mean human rights violations for people. So that way you see that we're moving from SDG 13, climate, agriculture, which is SDG 2. We're touching on SDG 16, which has to do with how people are treated. All of these different things are interconnected. And it's about first understanding the complexity of the situation and then using that to move forward. Now, one of the organizations that has recognized this and also recognized that this interconnectedness means we need to work together is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. They are, well, you could say a club, if you like, or a network organization of leading companies who have said, we want to be at the forefront. We don't want to wait for others. We want to be the first. And so they've joined together to form the WBCSD. Now, the WBCSD has identified 6 transformations, and they call them systemic transformations because these are things, as I said, they're going to require us to work together to change the way that we do things across the world. So really in the spirit of the SDGs. So the first one, circular economy. How do we recycle? How do we reuse things? How to make sure that we're not losing value from physical assets? Cities and mobility. How do people live? What do we do with transport? There are many, many people already in urban areas and more flocking. How do we make sure that that's done in a sustainable way? Climate and energy. How do we decarbonize, take the carbon out of our energy system and tackle climate change? How do we transform the agricultural system? How do we take care of biodiversity? One of the things that you saw in the planetary boundaries figure. And people, this includes aspects like poverty, inequality, diversity. And then right in the middle, you see what they call redefining value. And they mean specifically, because they're a business club, redefining value for business. So it's not only about short-term financial value, but it's about longer-term societal value. And I'm a big believer that if you want to look at financial value in the long term, you need to make sure that you're taking societal value. So looking after the environment, looking after people, looking after those SDGs, taking that into account to make sure that you're also financially viable in the long run. Now let's move this down again. Right, so at the moment, we're actually losing value. And this is financial value. So looking at societal value and translating it into financial value, there's a direct economic impact of the fact that we're not tackling global challenges. Now you can see a couple here, violence and armed conflict. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning, or touched on some of the elements we talked about, but also others across the board. So we're losing value by not addressing these things. More positively, well, it's about creating value. There are opportunities out there. And the same report, it's called Better Business, Better World, looking at the SDGs. And they said, if we work towards and if we achieve the global goals, the SDGs, that creates $12 trillion in opportunities per year. $12 trillion that are waiting to be captured. So the SDGs are good for business. Now here are a couple of them, just to give you some examples. It's not all of them. If you would like to know more, take a look at the report. The report was launched, I think, 2016, if I remember correctly, so just after the SDGs were launched. And if you look at this list, you'll see that many of the things that they predicted here, or set of opportunities, are already starting to grow. I won't tackle all of them, but I think some are very interesting. So if you look in the food and agricultural column, you'll see food waste, for example, but you'll also see low-income food markets, what's often referred to as the treasure at the bottom of the pyramid. So serving communities that have perhaps not been served before to improve their quality of life and to also generate a return. But also things car sharing. So we've seen Lyft, we've seen Uber. They've taken a bit of a dip with COVID, but before that, very, very strong. And if you look at the health and well-being side, I think a really interesting one is telehealth. So non-face-to-face consultations, but online or telephone consultations. And that's something that I think has been predicted for quite a while, especially for people in remote areas, can be very, very useful.
Hi, Linda. Sorry to interrupt. Can I ask you to be a bit loud, please? Sorry.
Sure. Let me turn the volume up.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
How about that? Is that better?
Yeah, better.
Perfect.
Thank you.
So, no problem. So if we go to telehealth, that's something that it's been around for a while. People have been predicting it for a while, but there has been a lot of resistance. And what we've seen with COVID is that that's been accelerated. So some of these opportunities have also been affected by what's happening in the world at the moment. And in the case of telehealth, I think positively. So it's really worth taking a look at this report, looking at a couple of the opportunities and having a think, yeah, what's happening there today and what's going to happen in the future. Now, how are businesses picking up on these opportunities? We can, of course, see in the newspaper or have a feeling for it, but what's happening? So PwC took a look at how companies are picking up on the SDGs, and they've done this for a number of years. I'm going to share with you the results from last year, from 2019, which is the latest one that's been published. Now, this report, PwC looked at the annual reports of companies around the world. Now, why do they look at annual reports? Because that's where you can really get information that has been audited, that it's it's solid, as opposed to marketing information that may or may not be verified. And what that does mean is that the results we're looking at tends to be for larger companies, because they are the ones that also have an annual report. So let's put that as a caveat. But having said that, this definitely, we've seen in the past, shows us the way that other companies are moving also. So it can be a very good indicator of the direction. Now, PwC looked at, you can see there are over 1,000 companies in 31 countries in different industries. What did they find? Now, let's down a bit. Have a look. There's good news and there's bad news. Companies are so.
I'll have to interrupt you again. The voice, I think the clarity has gone down again. Maybe it's the internet issue.
If I turn the volume up, how about that?
Still, it's not very, very clear, but
All right, shall we pause for a bit?
just give me a second. I will.
Just start again, yeah?
Please.
And let me know if the volume is not quite right. And if we need to do other slides, we can also go back. Okay. So how are companies picking up on the SDGs? Well, PwC has done some research into this. They've done it for the last couple of years. So I'm going to share with you the 2019 results, last year's, which is the most recent one. And what PwC has done is taken a look at the annual reports of large companies. Now, a couple of caveats to that. The reason they look at large reports is because then you get audited, independent, assured information. Whereas if you were to look at websites or other marketing materials, you don't always know whether that information has been verified. So that's the reason for looking at annual reports. What that means, though, is that they look at larger companies because those are the ones that also produce these reports. So take that into account. But at the same time, remember that what we often see is that the larger companies tend to show direction, and the small and medium enterprises tend to follow. Except, of course, for the social enterprises, which are ahead on sustainability in their own way. Now, so let's take a look at those results. PwC looked at over 1,000 companies in 31 countries and 7 industries. And they found good news and bad news. So companies are absolutely picking up on the SDGs, and they remain enthusiastic, and they continue to be enthusiastic. If we compare this to the results of PwC's research a number of years ago, then there absolutely have been strides forward. So we'll just pick out a couple of these results. The first one, 72% of those over 1,000 companies around the world mention the SDGs in the reporting. So somewhere the SDGs are popping up, which means awareness is high, and that's absolutely up from a number of years ago. At the same time, there is still some work to be done. So if you look at the next two, 21% include the SDGs in the CEO statement right at the beginning of the report. Now that's something which is really important because that tells the tone at the top. Is the leadership, the company leadership, really serious about the SDGs? Now that's encouraging, 21%, but there's room to grow. And the same you see similarly, 25% include the SDGs in their strategy. And there we mean not having a separate strategy or a separate foundation, but really saying the SDGs, sustainability is part of our business strategy for long-term growth. So again, encouraging, but absolutely still more work to be done. We see 65% refer to specific SDGs, not only the SDGs as a whole. And I'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation as well, why that's important. And then we get to the part where I think there's most room for improvement, which is talking about the specific targets. Now, remember I told you that under the 17 SDGs, there are 169 targets, which are much more specific. When companies really are looking at the SDGs in detail, then they're doing that at a target level. And so we expect them to be mentioning those SDG targets as well. That's only 14%. So that's something where there's room for growth. And at the same time, similarly, you see only 1% are actually measuring their performance against those targets. That's not to say that they don't have targets at all. They probably do. Many of them do. But those targets are then not explicitly linked to the SDGs. Now, before we go further, I'd like to share with you some guidance for companies who would like to integrate the SDGs into their organization. Now, again, as I said at the beginning, this guidance is focused on businesses, but it can be very useful for other organizations as well. I was lucky enough to be able to support GRI and the UN Global Compact with coming up with these two publications. The first one is called The Analysis of the Goals and Targets. And what it is a look at the 17 SDGs and the underlying targets, and then based on input from people across countries, across types of organizations, so businesses, academics, NGOs, you name it, based on their input, looking at which targets are specifically relevant for business, and also what businesses can do, some illustrative actions in order to contribute to those targets, and finally, what are indicators that could be used to measure progress. So that's the first one. I like to call it the menu. Basically, all right, where do I fit in when it comes to the SDGs? The second is how to choose from the menu. Now, it's focused on reporting, integrating the SDGs into corporate reporting. But I'll show you the steps in a little bit, and you'll see that I like to say that reporting and strategy are two sides of the same coin. Because you report on what you've done, but you use the results of that reporting to implement and improve your strategy. So if you're doing things right, that will be very, very much coherent with each other. So what's inside? We're going to take a look into that second publication. And I'm not going to pick out all of the steps. I'll talk about the three main ones, and then I'll pick out some of the more strategic ones to show you and talk to about in the rest of this presentation. So 3 steps here, you'll see in the middle there. The first one, step 1, defining priority SDG targets. We talked about that a little bit at the beginning. Choosing priorities. Why is that so important? Because you can't do everything, and you need to pick where to start. So I showed you those pictures of the SDGs being interconnected. This is about saying, well, where is my entry point as an organization? Where am I going to start? What levers am I going to pull or to move in order to make the impact that I want to make? And again, not only choosing your priority SDGs, but the SDG targets. So really looking at, well, what is meant by those SDGs? The second step, measure and analyze. So this is about saying, right, we've decided what we want to do. How are we going to set objectives and make those objectives quantitative with indicators so that we're tracking progress, so that we know whether we're on track and we know whether we're making the impact that we want to make. And then finally, report, integrate, and implement change. And I'm going to be focusing on the implement change part to give you a couple of tips and tricks. Not the kind of thing we can do in a very quick webinar, but just give you a couple of tips and tricks and things to think about when you're moving your organization to becoming more sustainable and more in line with the SDGs. So first of all, step 1, just take a minute or a couple of seconds to think, which SDGs do you think that companies prioritize? Which of those 17 do you think they're choosing? Well, I'll show you. These are results from the PwC research again. Let's move this up here so you can see it. There we go. Now what you see here is you see the 17 SDGs. It's a little bit small, so I'll explain it. And then you see the results. The ones that are brighter are the results from last year's research, and the ones that are a little bit faded are the ones from the year before. And what you see is which SDGs have been chosen most often by companies as a priority. And that is SDG 8, SDG 12, and SDG 13. So good jobs and economic growth, responsible consumption and production, SDG 12, and climate action, SDG 13. Now these results, PwC's been doing this since 2016, and they are very, very consistent. Every year across the board, these are the 3 SDGs that companies choose the most often. But I wonder if you can tell me, how do they differ by sector? Well, here the picture is interesting. Here you can see 5 sectors, some of them are grouped together. You see, first of all, the global total. I'll just read it out because I know it's pretty small. Consumer markets, energy, utilities and resources, financial services, industrial manufacturing, automotive, and then technology, media and telecoms. Now, what I find striking when I look at this picture is that there's very little differentiation between sectors. So you have, again, 8, 12, and 13 very often at the top, and then the 4 and 5, you do sometimes see a little bit of variation, but not much. Now, the first time I saw this picture, I was kind of shocked, and I thought, well, how can this be that there's not a lot of sector variation? Does this mean that companies are not really taking the SDGs seriously, or they're not grappling with them? Why is that? But then I thought about it, and I thought, well, you know, there's also something to be said, not only for the industry that you're in, but also what is the role of business compared to other actors in the other actors in society. So universities will tend to prioritize education, governments have their own specific priorities, and then if you think about it like that, then it makes sense that one of the main contributions of business is providing jobs, and also that they might tend to let's say, frame that in terms of SDG 8, looking at decent work, whereas in some cases they might just as be able to say, well, we're looking at poverty, and the way that we reduce poverty or reduce inequality, SDG 10, SDG 1, or SDG 1, SDG 10, is through the lever of jobs. So sometimes it's really just it's a question of framing. What we do see when we look a little bit deeper is that the companies that I work with, when they look at decent work and economic growth, they're often thinking about the people that they directly employ. Whereas those who are going a bit further are also starting to think about, well, what does this mean also in my supply chain? And that's when it starts to become, I think, really interesting and really impactful in terms of what you can do here. Now, if we look at step 2, this is really about saying we've got these priorities and now we're going to put them into practice. Now, if again we look at the results of the research, here we see, well, how many SDGs do companies prioritize? Now, you've got, let's say, a blip around 17, because there are companies that say, look, we're not going to choose. We think they're all equally important, and therefore we have 17. At the same time, you see that many companies, most of them do choose priorities, and that they tend to choose, let's say, between 5 and 9 priorities. Now, again, if you just look at this at, let's say, at a surface level, 5 to 9 sounds like quite a few priorities. If you think of, a company strategy, you normally have 3, 4, maybe 5 strategic pillars. Anything more than that, and it's very difficult for people to grapple and to really feel, okay, this is a priority. If you have too many priorities, no longer a priority. Having said that, if you look a step deeper, what's often the case is that companies will tier those priorities, similar to the wedding cake picture that I showed you earlier. So they'll say, well, these 1, 2, or 3, these are our main priorities. This is what we're going to focus on. And through that, we also want to tackle these secondary priorities. So you might, for example, focus on water, fresh water, sanitation, but through sanitation, tackle health, tackle inequality, tackle others as well. But I think the key message here is to say, well, think carefully, again, whether you're a company or whether you're a different kind of organization or even for yourself.
I'm sorry, you will have to repeat that. There seems to be some issue with the voice again.
Again? Oh dear. Okay. Where shall I start? From the beginning of this slide?
No. Just the last 10-15 seconds, we lost you. So companies prioritize between 5 and 9.
Okay. So companies, which is these companies prioritize between 5 and 9, which looks like a lot. If you think about it, most strategies have 3 to 5 strategic pillars, and that's what most people can handle. If you have too many priorities, it's no longer a priority. But if you scratch the surface and you look at what's happening, is that many companies are tiering that. So they'll, for example, choose water or sanitation as a priority, and then say, well, through that lever, we are then tackling, for example, health, or, for example, inequality by looking at sanitation and clean water. So I think the message here is to say, don't have too many priorities. Be clear about the choices that you make, what you want your levers to be, but at the same time, recognize that interconnectedness that we talked about earlier that allows you to tell a more nuanced story. And here again, just as a repeat, let me move that over for you. as a reminder, this is something where we really do see that there's work to be done. So 65% of companies are referring to specific SDGs. That could be higher, but when we're really getting specific in terms of how do we measure that, what are the targets, and are we linking that to the SDG targets? Really holding yourself to account, if you like, and also measuring so that you can be transparent to your stakeholders. Again, there's still a lot of work to be done. Now, the last thing that I'd like to pick out here is step 3, and specifically the part about implementing change. Here are a couple of tips, well, more than a couple, quite a few tips from business leaders on how to implement the SDGs. You can read up on them. The source, it comes from the PwC SDG Challenge. But I'm going to pick out a couple. So some of them sound a bit like a no-brainer, but still much harder to do in practice. Make it relevant. So explain to people, what do the SDGs mean for you? What's the impact of it in a way that people can understand? I read a really great example about a guy who designed X-ray machines, or brain scan machines. And what they found out is that most children who went into these machines needed to be sedated before they went in because they thought it was so scary. Well, what can you do? Sedation has a lot of risks also for children. So by making it into a more fun, less scary experience for children, you're also benefiting health outcomes. So make it relevant. Explain how it fits into people's daily work. Communicate from the top. So the leadership really needs to have a strong message, and explain how that fits into the bigger picture. So what's our part in the whole value? We may be a manufacturer that then
Sorry to interrupt you, Linda. I think it's happening again. We can't hear you. I
Okay.
think the internet is weak.
Let me try again. What's going on? Hang on. Let me move. Do you think we need to do the whole thing again?
No, from here, this slide.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I need the flow. So the next step, step 3, report, integrate, and implement change. So I'm going to focus on the part about implement change, and as promised, share a couple of tips with you from business leaders who've been able to make this change successfully and steer their organization towards the SDGs. So I'll tackle just a couple of them and pick out a few that I think are the most important. The first one is about making it relevant, making the SDGs relevant to somebody's daily work. So I had a great example about somebody who designed machines for a brain scan. And what he then discovered is that many children who needed a brain scan were so terrified of this giant machine that they needed to be sedated, which has its own health complications. So what he did was design a more child-friendly, more welcoming machine so that the levels of sedation dropped dramatically, leading to better health outcomes as a result. So this is what I mean by make it relevant. Explain what the SDGs mean and explain how you can contribute in your own job in your own terms. There needs to be communication from the top. So leadership, top leadership, middle leadership, really very strong about this is what we're going for. This is our choice, not only in words, but also in actions. When a dilemma comes up, do you choose short-term financial results? Do you choose long-term sustainability results? Do you find a way in between? Actions speak louder than words. Explaining the bigger picture and the value chain. So where do I fit in? Am I looking after my own employees, or am I also looking after people further on in the value chain? And how am I making that a core part of my organization and my strategy? Now, often to do that, you need to innovate. You need to collaborate with others in the supply chain. Well, not only the supply chain, others in the value chain. So whether it's your suppliers or your consumers. And you need to set up structures in order to be able to do that. structures including incentives for success. There's a great example a number of years ago, AkzoNobel, which is a Dutch chemicals company that also make paint, for example, that they put sustainability objectives in the reward systems for top management. Now, there are more and more companies following that example. Even recently, some energy companies. That's really putting your money where your mouth is. And to do that, you need to look at quantifiable objectives. We talked about that earlier. So measuring your progress, measuring your impact, and making sure that you're on track. And also being willing to say, look, we didn't meet this objective. Unilever is a great example there. Heineken is another one, where they report and they show, well, this is where we've met our objectives, this is where we haven't, this is why we haven't, and this is what we're going to do differently. Now, and communicate about that. It says here, consistent, seamless, regular communication. So communicate externally, communicate internally. Make sure it's a part of your meetings. Make sure it's a part of your day-to-day life, just like any aspect of your strategy would be. It's not something for the end of the year. It's something for every single day, that every person within the organization needs to know, what does this mean for me in my job? Now, short-term, long-term, we absolutely need to take care of the short-term. A bankrupt organization is not going to be helping anyone in the long run, but balance that short-term thinking with the long-term and look at the long-term value, whether it's financial or societal. And again, those are really connected. Don't just look at corporate responsibility, but look at the value that you can add. And we talked about it a couple of times. Don't just look at the SDGs, the goals, but really grapple with the targets underneath and think about, try to understand that complexity, because that's going to help you a better solution and to make more impact and add more value in the long run. Now here, I just would like to share a couple of these with you. We've talked a lot about companies, but within companies, of course, there are people. And whether it's the people at the top or the people at the bottom or the people in between, it's the people who are really helping to drive the company forward. Now, the UN Global Compact holds, well, you could say a competition or a scheme to recognize people who are making an extraordinary contribution. Last year, they did that in 15 countries, and these people you see here are the ones who were chosen as an SDG pioneer in their country. And they do a range of different things from this guy, Dylan McNeil, he does a lot of supply chain work. So really looking at how can we get our supply chain activated, to Sarah Whitten, looking at diversity within a financial institution. So if you're looking for inspiration, thinking about, well, what can I do? Then this is a great place to start and look at some of the things that these people have been doing. Some more inspiration and further resources. The UN Global Compact has some fantastic resources for business. They also have free webinars that you can follow if you want to learn more, loads of publications. The World Business Council, mentioned them already, also has a lot of resources that you can use. And one of them, I think that's particularly interesting because it really makes things practical, is for a number of sectors, and more are coming. They have these sector roadmaps. So we've got one here, these are just some of the examples for the forest sector or the cement sector in India or chemicals. What can the sector do together collaboratively in order to move sustainability forward? And I think that's great because then you can learn from others and stand on the shoulders of giants, if you like, in order to move forward quicker. Now, finally, I'd like to show you the Good Life Goals. They're not necessarily focused on business, but with the idea, as I said before, businesses are made up of people. Now, what can you do in your work and also in your daily life in order to advance the SDGs? The Good Life Goals are a translation of the SDGs. You can see them here, 17, just like the SDGs. And underneath each of these are concrete, very practical activities that you can do in your own life, whether it's throwing away less food or turning off the tap when you brush your teeth, just very simple things so that you in your personal life can also help to advance sustainability. And that brings me to the final question. At work, at home, what will your contribution be to the SDGs? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. That was a superb presentation. You started with the basics and went out all the way where you help companies select the SDGs, the number of SDGs, and which one should they be focusing on. So that was a job well done. Thank you very much, Linda.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So I have a comment here. Some fourth or fifth last slide. You said the number of SDGs that a company selects. So there are 2% of the companies select one SDG, and then the number goes on. Between 4 and 10, and 5 and 9, they select 8, 9, 7, 6, 5%. Yeah, so
Yep.
anything about 5 is so that is how the distribution was done of the SDG. But really what happens is, because I work with a lot of companies here in India, we Indian companies or Chinese companies will always be under a lot of pressure because we are developing countries. Let's say that creating roads is a pollutant. Yeah, for example, when you make road, you pollute. So we don't have a choice. We need roads because we have 1.5 billion people. Yeah, and so if you don't have so many people, or if your roads are already made, you can stop polluting. So so when you look at that macro picture from a country's point of view, so really there is no choice. We need the roads, we need the highways and the roadways and the bridges. So so that is one aspect of the corporates being able to follow SDGs. However keen you may be to follow, there are limitations because of the sheer size of the population, the sheer demand, and the onus of being a growing or a developing economy. One more thing that I wanted to say is, see, usually the old adage, polluters pay. Yeah. So if you are an oil and gas company, and if you select an SDG of literacy for all, I think that is hogwash. It should not work like that. Yeah. So,
Yes.
yeah.
So
So
shall I comment a bit about those? Because I think you raised two
I am trying to get your comments.
excellent points. So thank you for that. So I'll tackle the second one first, because that's maybe the easiest one. If you look at that publication that I talked to you about, I really just picked a couple of things out. But one of the important aspects when you choose your priorities is that you can't just choose whatever you want. You need to really look at what's core to my company and what we do, but also what does the outside world say? What do the stakeholders say? And you need to choose something that's part of your company. So if you are oil and gas, you need to be looking at energy. You need to be looking at climate. You can also say, maybe it's also about access to energy, the social aspects to energy. But you cannot just choose something that's completely different, because it really doesn't work like that. It needs to be core to your company strategy. You're not sustainable if you're creating a lot of negative impact somewhere and then trying to cover it up, let's say, with positive impact in a completely different thing. It's like you're paying off your conscience, right? It doesn't work like that. It's about looking, how can you increase your positive impact, but also how can you reduce your negative impact in a way that's very close to your key activities as a company. So if you make fizzy drinks, you need to be thinking about sugar, you need to be thinking about water. It really these aspects that are part of the business. So that's the first one. The second point, well, actually the first point that you raised, which is excellent. Each company is within a context. So I think that's part of what you were saying, right? And there are social demands and environmental demands and many different kind of demands. We usually tend to think that better economy means worse environment, right? Sometimes we think like that, and sometimes it is like that. Sometimes there is a trade-off, and then you have to make a decision within that trade-off. But sometimes, and that's where the innovation part comes in, you could say, well, we can provide energy, for example, clean energy that's better for the environment and raises the living standards for people. So sometimes there's a win-win, and I'm convinced that there's a win-win more often than we think there is. Sometimes we just take the easy way out. You know, again, sometimes there is a trade-off, but not always. So I think that's a part of it. And something else that you touched on as well, you know, there's so many things important in our organization. If we just choose one priority, what about the rest? And that's something that comes up a lot. And I understand that because, you know, it's true. What we see, you kind of have it makes it difficult, right? Whether you're talking about sustainability or whether you're talking about, let's say, ordinary non-sustainability company strategy, you
Correct.
always have this tension that if you want people to really do something, you need to just stick to that thing and repeat, and then, you know, it's part of change, the very clear message. If you add too many nuances, then the message starts to be diluted and it's less effective.
Correct.
But the world has nuances. So it's a balancing act. And in some cases, in some companies, in some contexts, in some culture, it means 1. In others, it means 5 or whatever. What we see more and more often as a way to deal with this is, you know, I said this kind of layered approach that they say, well, you know, we're going to focus on these SDGs and these are our levers. And through that, we touch on this and we touch on that. Or we make sure, you know, maybe we say our priority is infrastructure, SDG 9, we're going to build the road. But when we do that, we make sure that we take care of people who need to be relocated. Which would be, I think, SDG 16, or looking at the rights of people who need to be relocated. So there are ways around that to make sure that you have a clear message, but also reflect the nuance of the situation. Does that help a bit?
Absolutely.
Because I think it's a really important
yes.
question.
Yes, I just wanted you to touch upon the context, you know, the contextuality of every company when they design a strategy. So you see, it is not really easy. It is a very difficult thing to make. You know, it's not that if you understand SDGs and you understand a little bit of pollution, you can go ahead and frame a sustainability strategy. It doesn't work like that. It is very contextual. It is very complex. And if we were to achieve the goals, we really need to spend a lot of time on the strategy itself.
Yeah, I am 100% in agreement with you. And I think that, especially because it should not be a separate sustainability strategy, it needs to be really integrated with corporate strategy, and that makes it even more complicated. But if you don't do that, and I've seen it happen time and time again, then it's a beautiful sustainability strategy. But when things get tough, then people choose the other direction and they choose the core strategy and they forget about the sustainability strategy because it's, you know, inconvenient. So that's why if you do the tough work at the beginning and really bring it together, because it is hard, you're right, it is hard, but it's not impossible.
Oh yeah, correct. Absolutely. So thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. I remember we have one more question to go before we end this session. So, you know, you were going to make a point, or you were going to say something about students making a difference.
Thank you. You're right. Thank you. Thanks for reminding me. So what I wanted to say is I showed for the value for business, I showed a number of business opportunities. But there are other aspects of values for business and sustainability. And one of the really important ones is attracting talent. So what you see is the younger generation are, first of all, incredibly creative when it comes to sustainability. So you see a lot of companies that really are making the transition to be sustainable. They're combining a kind of top-down leadership approach with a bottom-up creativity and innovation approach. And that comes from young people and students. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, a lot of that comes from there. And if you're a company that is very committed to sustainability, you can attract a lot of students and attract a lot of that talent. So I think that, you know, students don't underestimate the impact that you can have, because it's huge, not only as a student, but also when you enter the workforce. You have a lot to offer companies, and make sure you join the right one.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to hear that. I'll tell you why. When we started CASI in New York, you know, the CSR and Sustainability Institute, and in our early days, today we are present in 50 countries. We have 1 million students. But in my early days, 10 years back, people used to ask me, children used to ask me, or teachers used to ask me, why should I study CSR? Because it does not directly lead to a job, you see. It is not an engineering or an accounting subject. So everybody asked me this topic, why should I study CSR? And I used to give them a lot of reasons why they should study CSR. But as a tagline to my company, which I originally developed, you know, so I wrote the tagline myself when I started the company. So the tagline was, corporates prefer CSR and sustainability certified students. So that was the tagline. Yeah, that corporates will prefer
There
to
you
hire
go.
you if you are certified in CSR and sustainability. So, you know, we did that 10 years back. And now we are reaping the fruits. You know, now we can see that corporates really prefer to recruit these students. So on that happy note, thank you very much once again. And I look forward to
It's a pleasure.
seeing you at the Roundtable Conference. You know, on the date which you'll be there, and even today. So thank you very much, Mitesh.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Our pleasure. Linda, let me assure you, even though my video was off for most part of the presentation today, I was sitting on the edge of my seat and listening to your entire presentation. Because of the internet issues, I had kept it off. I'm
sorry.
I specifically loved the way you made a point that corporates should ensure that their business strategies are aligned with their CSR strategies. And let me know if there is any royalty to be paid. I will be using your slide on the one where the countries are saying that if it is vaccines, you know, I'll need it first. I'll need it first. But if it is climate change, you do it first. You do it first.
That's a great one. I can't find where it comes from. I pulled it off LinkedIn. So all the others I have a source, but it's the only one I don't have a source. Yeah. No, take it. Use it. Yeah, is the sound okay? Because if we need to do it again, then we have to do it again.
Sure. I'll get a green signal from my studio. If I don't, I'll reach out to you again.
Okay,
but
cool.
Thank you so much for today. It was an amazing session.
Well, it was really fun to do. So thanks a lot. And I won't be able to make the roundtable this afternoon.